joining us on today's webinar about finding out a little bit more about the Value Toolkit. The session is going to be recorded. There was a couple of people that showed interest and were unable to join us today, so we can share a recording of the session after the event. My name's Kat Griffith-Williams. I'm the CEO of Constructing Excellence. We've been working with the Construction Innovation Hub and looking at defining regional profiles, so specifically for Wales. So I know a couple of you have kindly been inputting into that. But what we're finding is a lot of questions really about from the sector about an appetite to use and implement the Value Toolkit, and others that have limited awareness and understanding of what actually is the Value Toolkit and its importance in the sector. So really this is a great opportunity for us to explore that, and we're lucky to have Ellie Jenkins here, who is going to make the presentation about the Value Toolkit on behalf of the Construction Innovation Hub. Just to give you a little bit of a background for those that don't know what Construction Excellence Wales is about, we're based on best practice in construction. I look like I've frozen. I'm not sure if you, oh, there, I'm back again, sorry. Yeah, we're based on best practice in construction and about collaboration. We represent the whole of the supply chain in Wales. We've got our great awards ceremony coming up, so we're looking for our submissions for entries for that, which is the closing date is on Friday, so that's quite exciting because we see some fantastic built environment and civils projects coming through as well that way. We are based on the Egan and Latham reports, Rethinking Construction. And everything that we do is aligned to Welsh Government strategy and policies, and we have input into the Ministerial Construction Forum and help shape and formulate that. If we go on to the next one. Thank you. Again, everything that we do is aligned with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and I've really just described everything that we do. Our contact details are on the next slide. So if you are unfamiliar with us, do link in with us. Please give us your insight, become a member, and do just engage. But you're here to listen about the Value Toolkit. I'm going to pass you over to Ellie Jenkins now, who's going to give us a run through of a little bit more about what is the Value Toolkit. So over to you, Ellie.
Thanks so much, Kat. So it's really lovely to be here today. My name is Ellie Jenkins. I'm a partner at a consultancy called Akerlof, but I'm also the industry project lead for the Value Toolkit, which essentially means that I lead the strategic direction of the Value Toolkit and ensure that we are appropriately interfacing with both our industry and government side. So what I wanted to do today is to give you a high-level overview of the Value Toolkit, and I won't spend a huge amount of time going through millions and reams of slides, but what I want to do is ensure that we've got plenty of time afterwards for questions and discussions. So I'll talk you through where we're at, with the caveat that we are evolving and we're right in the middle of technical development work. And that's taking place, so we will relaunch into industry at scale later in this year. So some of these pieces of work are slightly movable feasts at the moment. So it's probably worth just introducing the Construction Innovation Hub very quickly. The Construction Innovation Hub have created the Value Toolkit in partnership with industry and government. And the Construction Innovation Hub is a 4-year funded R&D programme. It's funded by government as part of the Transforming Construction Challenge. And as it suggests, the Transforming Construction Challenge is looking to drive sustainable change within the sector. And one of the changes that was set as part of the Transforming Construction Challenge brief was to look at how we could shift models within the sector to move away from lenses that solely looked at cost and sometimes cost and programme delivery, to looking at a slightly broader view of what value means for our infrastructure investments. And what's quite interesting to me is that I've been working on the Value Toolkit for 2.5, nearly 3 years now. And in that time, I've seen a change or a shift, certainly in the narrative within the sector. And what's interesting to me is that for lots of the projects that we're working on at the moment, there is an additional focus. So now we're looking at cost, programme and climate or carbon reduction. And for me, that's interesting. That's a really positive step forward. It's brilliant that we're having more narrative, more discussion around our climate impacts. But one of the things that there for me is a note of caution. So yes, it's really important that we look at climate and carbon, and yes, that's time critical. But actually, climate and carbon is so interrelated with other areas of value that we need to be really cautious that we're not ending up with a sole view on climate, because that really only gets us one step on from where we are now. So within the value toolkit, we advocate that we need a broader view of value that looks at all of the different areas of value that we can create, because actually, as you'll see from the graphic there, they're completely interrelated. So looking at them in isolation just doesn't really work. So in terms of the value toolkit and what it is and what it means, the value toolkit has been designed specifically for clients. It's to help clients in making more value-based decisions, to ensure that we're working towards a more sustainable built environment, but also a more sustainable model for our sector. That means that the contractors and the consultants aren't also working on a cost-first basis. The idea is that by using the value toolkit, clients are able to more consistently articulate what value means to them, make sure that they have the right mechanisms in place, the right structures in place to realise those areas of value, and then that they can be measured accordingly. One of the things that I've certainly seen over the last few years is that clients sometimes are quite good at that upfront piece, that they're understanding what value means to them. They have structures that guide that. But actually what we almost inevitably always see is that there is a loss of value as you go through the project phases. We'll talk through it in a bit more detail as I go through, but the value toolkit has been designed to work at project, programme and portfolio level. But through our pilot stage, through our testing stage, it was certainly the project space that had the most attention. So maybe if we spend a few minutes looking at the why and potentially the where the value toolkits come from. So clients have been saying for many years now that they are facing an increasingly complex decision-making environment where they're constantly asked to trade off on different areas of value and prioritise different areas of value as well. Now, through the other side of my role, we spend a lot of time working on business case development and embedding kind of social value and sustainability within that stage. And what we can see is that clients are grappling with increasing amounts of policy. Now, what's interesting about this is that actually in terms of the clients that we work with, we work across the UK. And actually what Wales have that is different to England is a very clear set of drivers through your Future Generations Act, which is really helpful. But still, clients are trying to balance out different priorities, different areas of value. And in the private sector, there is obviously a significant uplift in the amount of ESG related funds, which is driving change within the private sector as well. What you can see on the right-hand side here is probably the graphic that has become the most synonymous with the value toolkit. And essentially what it shows you is a client's view of what value means to them for a specific intervention. And what we do is we work across a 4 capitals model. So you can see that within the produced capital, you've got that cost quality efficiency matrix that is very typical to most infrastructure projects. You've got the natural capital, which is everything you'd expect to see in the environmental side. And although there is much more crossover now between the environmental and the social value side, the human and social side sit more typically within that social value landscape. So really simply put, the value toolkit is a series of steps or activities that a client can undertake throughout the life cycle of an asset. So right from the earliest stages of decision making all the way through to deciding whether the asset is still fit for purpose. Supported by tools. So there is a digital web app that supports the process to be delivered, and also detailed guidance. So it's probably important noting at this point that although this is a tool developed for clients, our expectation is that it will be a tool that is facilitated by the market. So that might be consultants, that might be architects, that might be contractors. And actually through the pilot stage, we've had all 3, as well as a whole raft of SMEs learning how to facilitate the value toolkit. So those 2 things need to go hand in hand, because the client will need someone, whether it's an internal person or an external facilitator, to guide them through the process. The why, to help better articulate those clearer value definitions and ensure they're properly and effectively realised. And the how. Now this is a changing landscape at the moment. So at the moment we have 5 streams of activity within the value toolkit. which we'll go on to talk through in a little bit more detail. Now, one of the things that we found as we're going through some technical iteration work at the moment is that we're likely to condense the number of streams of activity that we have into 2 streams of activity. So what you see launched later this year may look slightly different to this picture at the moment. So let's talk through those 5 streams as they stand at the moment, accepting that that landscape might change slightly. So in terms of where they sit at the moment, the first stream is around defining value. So helping a client to understand, using that 4 capitals model, what value means to them for a specific investment or intervention. That's then really clearly articulated through the value profile, but also through a set of outcome statements that outline essentially what the client is trying to drive through design and delivery. This is a very activity-based stream. It takes about 3 workshops to run a client through, and there are very clear outputs in terms of what the client gets at the end and a structured report. There's then activities around risk and client approach. Now, it's likely that through, I'm so sorry, there's a very loud noise in the background, so my apologies if you can hear that lorry reversing. The risk and client approach are likely to become 1 stream of activity. And essentially this says, okay, well, if I as a client understand what value means to me, am I best structured through my commercial strategy, my delivery models and my approach to risk to be able to realise that value? Now, these are much more cultural streams. So there are some activities that sit within client approach that help to guide a client on where they currently sit in terms of commercial strategies and delivery models and where they might want to get to. But it isn't a hard and fast rule. And the risk side, again, is more guidance that essentially helps clients reframe the way they approach value. There's then another activity stream, which is around measurement and evaluation that says, okay, if I understand what value means to me, do I have the right metrics and performance ranges in place to be able to understand if something is meeting my definition of value? So essentially what that is creating a series of scorecards for optioneering, design, delivery, and then understanding what ultimate success looks like. So that helps a client to effectively compare options against that value profile. There's then a final stream of activity, which is around appointments. Now, again, this is less of an activity stream, but it's more a guidance note that helps a client to understand who they might need around them at specific points to be able to make these decisions. So it's very likely that as we go into the industry-wide launch, risk and client approach will become 1 stream and value definition and measurement will also become 1 stream. So it might feel like a fairly intensive, very complex process. And to a degree, you need to be able to understand the structures behind it to be able to facilitate it. But it is a very simple process logic. So firstly, we look at what value means to the client in the context of the project or programme that they're looking at. That's value definition. We then help a client to understand how they'll know if something meets their definition of value, and that's measurement and evaluation. And then finally, we've got the stream of activity that says, okay, well, if I know all of those things, then how can I best tailor my approach as a client to stand the best possible chance of realising that value? And that's client approach and risk. So this is a little bit of a breakdown, and what you can see here, and part of the reason that we're looking to bring that value definition and measurement and evaluation stream together is that there is a very natural flow through between those streams of activity. So the first thing we look at is what is driving that client decision making. That might be national policy like the Future Generations Act, it might be local policy, it might be organisational policy. And we also within this section define some very core outcomes for the projects. So if we think about an infrastructure project for the justice system, it might be that one of those core outcomes is around delivering increased capacity for prisons. We then go down to another level and say, okay, well, if we understand what's driving our project and what some of the very core outcomes are, how can we then go about identifying what are the specific things that we can do within design and delivery that help us to realise some of those high level outcomes and drivers? We then go through a step which is prioritising, so understanding what is more important relative to another. And then finally, we rationalise. Now, this rationalising step is often missed, and it was missed as part of our pilot by some of our facilitators as well, but it's a really critical step. Part of the value for me, as my background is in a social value practitioner, part of the value is that it brings all the different areas of value together up front to help clients understand where the points of conflict or points of trade-off might be. Now, in my background as a social value practitioner, we are quite often brought in to write elements of this strategy, often working with other stakeholders, but largely in isolation. Now, the challenge with that is that if we've got another set of stakeholders that are developing another strategy that directly conflicts with the strategy that's being developed around social value or around environmental practice, further down the line, the client will have problems where they will have to make a choice about what they're going to prioritise. And essentially what the Value Toolkit does is just move that discussion up front. So clients can see up front where they're going to have to trade or make some compromise. So if we take an example of a client that is absolutely adamant that they're going to drive local procurement across the largest percentage that they possibly can, but equally they're committed to only procuring sustainable materials that can't be sourced within the local area. This is a sort of discussion that the Value Toolkit enables clients to have up front. The last part of the value definition process is saying to a client, okay, well, if this is what you want to achieve, how will you know what success looks like? Now, what that does is that sets some high-level metrics to help a client understand that at the end of the process, when they look back, how they know that they'll have achieved that success. We then go through and look at the different phases from optioneering, design, and into delivery to see whether that metric can be pulled across, or it shouldn't be measured in that phase, or potentially that a proxy metric is needed. And we set performance ranges and targets for each one of those phases that helps a client compare different design options or different delivery options. And then we advocate that performance should be monitored. Now, there's a point here that I think is really important to raise. Within the Value Toolkit, we don't dictate metrics. So, for example, we won't say, if you're trying to measure this specific outcome around local apprenticeships, you must use this metric. What we'll say is, these are all of the known metrics that exist within the market that might help you measure that outcome. Now, that's because there are already a huge amount of proprietary systems that have really detailed metric sets. So the likelihood is that as you go on to monitor performance, what you'll need to do is drop back into the system just to update the values. So we've talked a little bit about this already. In terms of the Value Toolkit, it works equally well across public and private. We've trialled it, we've tested it, buildings and infrastructure. We've tested it across new build, refurb and retrofit. There is a question which we've done lots of market research around in terms of the application of the Value Toolkit and whether it needs to be for a particular scale of project. Now, the feedback that we've had from clients for the market research that we've done suggests that projects over 5 million would be suitable, with projects over 20 to 25 million being most applicable. So that gives you a little bit of a range. As we've said, it's facilitated. So as we go into the industry launch, people will be able to train and become certified facilitators of the Value Toolkit. And we're currently developing that training and assurance regime. We also know that some of the clients, particularly the public sector clients that we've worked with, are going to look to build some in-house resource. But what we think is likely to happen is that those clients will have some in-house resource, but ultimately a lot of it will go to be outsourced to external consultancies. We've talked about the application across projects, programs and portfolios, and I'm really happy to talk through this a little bit more detail when we get to the Q&A session. So the way the Value Toolkit's been developed is we had about 18 months worth of intensive technical development. We worked with Constructing Excellence, who were brilliant in helping us understand how the market was likely to respond to the Value Toolkit. But we also had over 200 industry and government individuals working on it on a day-to-day basis to help us develop it. So this is not something that we as a Construction Innovation Hub have gone into an isolated, very dark room for 2 years, developed and then tested on the market. This has been developed fully in partnership with industry and government. In fact, one of our earliest piloters was the Welsh housing team. And once we'd gone through that 18 months worth of technical development, we moved into a pilot phase. Now, for that pilot phase, we were looking for around 25 organisations to sign up to say they wanted to learn how to be facilitators. We actually got to 140 and then we had to close applications because we're a tiny team and we had no way anticipated the scale of interest from industry in terms of training to be a facilitator. So we took 140 organisations, and some of those sent one person, some of them sent 10 people to be trained through a series of training to enable them to test the Value Toolkit. And between April and November of last year, the Value Toolkit was tested across a massive range of projects. We're now in a space where we're just taking on board all of the feedback from that pilot. So we're back in a room with our industry and government team, tailoring the Value Toolkit ahead of its wider launch. So as we look forward to that launch, it's probably worth thinking, well, what do we mean by launch, and what's that launch going to look like? Now, some of that is a little bit unknown. So the Construction Innovation Hub is a 4-year funded R&D programme, and it comes to the end of its life in September. So by the time we get to September, we need the Value Toolkit to have a home where the guidance, the training and the access to the web app can be supported in the long term. Now, our intention is that it goes back into the public sector to act as a custodian in that space. And those discussions are very live at the moment with central government teams. But by the time we get to launch, we should have a clear, updated, integrated process supported by guidance and handbooks. We'll have training standards, a competency framework and the core facilitator training up and running. And we'll also have a detailed web app. Now that's as proof of concept. So it is up and running at the moment, but clearly whoever takes the ongoing legacy of the Value Toolkit will need to do some work to embed it into their existing processes and tools or license it out. This is all going to be underpinned by a BSI Flex standard. Now, what that means is that the core methodology is embedded in a standard so that it can continue to be rolled out at scale across the board. Now, the reason we've chosen a BSI Flex standard is because it enables us to ramp up that development very quickly. So we're able to develop the first version of a Flex within 6 months. So that's the reason that we've gone for the Flex. But that standard is critical to ensuring the methodology is really there and stamped by BSI. So that's as much as I wanted to go through now. I'm going to close my screen so that I can see all your faces again. I'd welcome any questions or thoughts.
Thanks, Ellie. That's hugely helpful, actually, in terms of processes as well, about where you're currently at and what we're anticipating to look for launch. This is really your opportunity. I've got a couple of questions that have come to my mind, but please do raise a hand. I'll bring you in, and if you want to use the chat function, do that. So I'm really urging you to engage here. I'll go ahead if that's okay. A couple of questions that I've had from industry is expressions of interest for the pilots. Obviously, you've said that you were inundated in the first instance and you've gone ahead with that. And then we've got the launch, really. So that's kind of up to industry, really, to take that on board. Is that right? Or how do we encourage people to utilise and adopt the Value Toolkit when there's expressions of interest already out there?
So it's a really tricky balance, Kat. And I think one of the things that's really positive is that the industry has grasped it. And also we know clients have grasped it as well, probably slightly quicker than we'd anticipated they would. So we're getting a lot of questions at the moment where it's being built into client tenders, which is probably slightly ahead of where we'd planned for that to take place. But that's really positive. So what we've said to other organisations that we're working with that are really active and want to facilitate in this space, we've said the best thing you can do for now is to properly get to grips with the overview guidance. So download it from the website, understand what it means, and ensure that you're starting to build in some of the language and narrative into your tenders, so that as the Value Toolkit is launched at the end of May and sort of into early June time, you've almost prepared your clients that this is coming and that it's something that you will look to facilitate. That's probably the best advice that I can give at the moment, accepting that we are in a slightly tricky space whereby we can't support more pilots at this stage as much as we'd love to.
Thanks, Ellie. I'll park my other two questions because I've got some from attendees. Thank you, Jane, for putting up your hand. We've got Jane O'Leary.
Hi there. I'm just interested in how is this going to be embedded with clients? I think industry is always really keen to take up on these things, and the more challenge sometimes is getting, particularly in Wales, some of the local authorities and other public sector bodies to take this on board. So how is that, going to be driven and embedded within the client side?
So I think it's a really interesting example, and I think certainly the construction playbook has helped, particularly within the English market. So that guides that actually those policies need to be rolled out, and the value toolkit is signposted too. I think in terms of working with Welsh Government to see if we can embed similar policy outcomes that support the Welsh Generations Act is probably going to be quite a critical next step. Now, we're actively doing that in Scotland at the moment. We've got a bit more work to do to ensure that we're working with the Welsh Government side and ensuring that they can use the value toolkit as effectively as they can. From a local authority perspective, we've got some really lovely case studies where local authorities are talking about the benefits that they found from using the value toolkit. And for me, certainly my experience of working with local authorities, it is that peer-to-peer network that seems to drive that cultural change more than the kind of top-down policy approach. So what we can do is we'll make sure that CE are cited on all the case studies that we've collected through the pilot so that you can use those really effectively. I guess what's interesting is that we are seeing clients and frameworks embed it already. So the driver is coming, and probably slightly more in advance of where we'd thought it would be. So the likes of Scape have already embedded commitments in their most recent framework about value-based delivery. So the change is coming, and I know that some of ISG's competitive partners that were involved in the pilot are already using it to respond to specific client-based questions.
Yeah, as I say, I don't. It's not industry side. I think industry. I've come from the private sector, so public sector. So it's how we help, embed that within our public sector side to make sure, because I think the private sector absolutely will be taking this on board. So I think it's about working with Welsh Government because they haven't endorsed things like the playbook in Wales. So we haven't got those same drivers. Yes, it's great we've got the Future Generations Act, which other places haven't got. So it's just making sure there's that link up, isn't it, to make sure that it is driven, all the way through our policies, all the way through in Wales.
I think that's a really fair point, Jane. So when we looked at the client side research for legacy, when we said to clients, right, what will it take for you to adopt it? They said three things broadly. We need to be able to have policy that directs us that it's the right thing to do. We need to be able to have case studies to help us understand the benefits and why we would take the time to do it. And we need to have an industry that's prepared to support us through the process. Now, those two first parts, we've absolutely got down. So we've got the case studies under development at the moment. That third part in England, we've got really well down, but there is more work that needs to be done in Wales. As an interim step, we've mapped the value toolkit back to the Welsh Generations Act, which we can share that mapping with you to show that there is a direct flow down in terms of how you can use the value toolkit to support you in achieving some of those broader goals.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Thanks. I'll take a question that's been raised in the chat, and then I'll bring Daniel German in to ask a question. So Natalie Hawkins has asked about how Welsh National TOMs and the Welsh Government Community Benefits Toolkit, which is in Housing Associations Wales, have been involved with the process. I know that you alluded to it when you said looking at the processes, Ellie, there. So I just wanted you to kind of give some more detail on that, really.
That's absolutely fine. So obviously I mentioned in the process that we don't dictate metrics, and it's a tricky balance, but I will give you my perspective, which is all I can give you. But from as a social value practitioner, my view is that the value toolkit sits a step before where I would naturally come into the process. So what that's doing is setting up a very high level view of the core outcomes that can be delivered across all of those areas of value. What I have done and what I do from a social value perspective is I then take that and then break it down into much more detailed metrics and measures with a supporting social value statement. And those metrics and measures come from anywhere. So they can come from TOMS, they can come from Loop, they can come from Thrive. So any other social value practices that you have, they can just be fed in. And actually it is quite a seamless process. You may want to build in far more metrics than we kind of have outlined, in which case it would sit a kind of step down. But there is a very natural flow through from the value toolkit into detailed metric sets like TOMS.
Thank you. I think that's really clear. If anyone has any comments, do let us know. But thank you, Ellie. Daniel Germain, can I bring you in?
Yes, Germain gets everyone that surname. I do apologise.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Ellie, really interesting session. So thanks for that. Just a quick one. I'm from Faithful and Gould. I'm a consultant within Faithful and Gould. We have written and facilitated lots of business cases for local authority as well as central UK government. So recently completing sort of SOCs and OBCs and FBCs. Does the value toolkit work alongside or replace any components, I guess, of the more traditional strategic outline cases, outline business cases, and the full business cases?
So that's a really good question, Daniel. And actually part of the reason that we're right in that middle state of flux is because we've been working directly with the Green Book team to ensure we are aligned. So what you'll see when we launch the industry-wide version is you'll see slight language changes. And also, I caught myself tripping over them today because obviously this is a deck that gives us the current state, but we're also reinventing some of those, particularly the language that we use. So I got caught a little bit between those two worlds today. But yeah, so we're working directly with Green Book. We've got our final workshop with them next Thursday. And that is just, they're really happy with the alignment. They just want us to look at some of the language changes to ensure that there is seamless transfer across.
Brilliant.
Now we've got a slight challenge in that the very front end of the value toolkit you could probably do and facilitate if you followed the Green Book guidance letter for letter. But the challenge that we have is that our value toolkit has to be designed so that it can support clients that don't use the Green Book process as well as those that do.
Sure.
So some of that front end bit you might look at and go, okay, well, we'll just do the Green Book process as it stands. Or you might think, well, there are things here that I can take that will enhance it. And the Green Book team are quite comfortable that you can use it in that context. So yes, we're working really hard to ensure that there is alignment and that it adds value. It's taking quite a bit of time to get to that point. But it's looking pretty good. And actually we work with Hannah Edmonds at F&G. So it's worth picking up with Hannah because she's pretty cited on where we're at.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I work quite closely with Hannah as well, so I'll do that. I'll use your name in vain. That's great. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Super. Again, just we have got a little bit of time for any further questions. There's two that I have. It might be quite simple answers to these, but in Wales, you made a reference to projects, ideally in a larger project capacity, 25 million, saying it could be suitable for over 5 million. Are there barriers to using the value toolkit under 5 million, or is it just better fitted for much larger projects? I'll just park that one. And just the very quick question as well, are you in conversations with Welsh Government to be the custodian when the Construction Innovation Hub's funding ceases or is relinquished? Is it just UK Government? Thanks, Ellie.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll take the larger projects one first. And I have to be quite careful what I say in this space. So clearly I'm an advocate of value-based decision making. And so when we look at things like the value definition stream of activity, essentially what we're looking at there is 3 core workshops with key stakeholders. Now, for me, coming from a sustainability background, I think that if you're spending £1 million, 3 workshops is a reasonable amount of time to spend to ensure that you're driving the right behaviours up front. That said, some of the feedback that we've had is around whether that's too much of a burden in terms of those smaller projects. So it isn't that there is any cutoff or cap, or we're suggesting, it's just that the feedback that we've had from clients says, you know, we wouldn't be able to necessarily get the right stakeholders around the table 3 times for a project that is less than that value. I would really advocate that as a minimum, say part of the value toolkit was creating a value definition framework. So that's those 4 capital areas with the categories that sit within them and a definition. And that took well over a year to develop with hundreds of stakeholders. And it is specifically designed for infrastructure. So what I would say is if clients are saying, it's too much, we can't commit to the whole process, I'd say, okay, let's have one workshop. Let's look at the value definition framework and let's structure some of the things that we want to achieve around that. That is probably the best version. But yeah, in my mind, yes, you should absolutely be doing it for every project, but maybe that's not practical.
That's really cool, thanks.
On the government side, we are working directly with UK government to be the overarching custodian, but one of the specific questions that we're working through with them at the moment is what does that look like from a devolved perspective, to ensure that there aren't then barriers for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to be able to access the value toolkit, particularly from a public sector perspective. So we have a driver as part of an innovation programme to drive change, particularly within the public sector, and for us it's really critical that we don't inadvertently, in handing over the assets back to UK government, end up in a position where devolved governments can't access them and use them to their benefit as well.
That's great. That answers that question perfectly. Thank you. Any other questions that anybody would like to ask Ellie Jenkins while we are on? Hi, Sean, you just popped up there and your hand came simultaneously.
Yeah, just a very quick one. I must admit, I didn't come in the beginning of the session, so I might have already missed it. You say this sits above the TOMs in terms of specific metrics, and obviously in terms of social value, the sort of measurement element of that. This obviously is more of a planning tool in terms of the outset of projects. And just thinking out loud, where does this then fit with the planning process in terms of looking at options, in terms of community engagement and things like that, when we're looking at perhaps not just the financial viability of options on certain schemes, and I'm talking from a housing background, but also looking at that social and environmental aspects, and looking at sort of town centre regeneration schemes and things like that. So is this intended to come before the planning process? Is this the toolkit to use at the outset of the project?
So we've used it at all stages, Sian, and it kind of through the pilot was quite a handy thing to be able to do. So we very much set out with the view that we were doing this at the earliest REBA stages. But what we found is that by the nature of forcing timelines around the pilot, that some clients just had to pick it up and use it further down the process at REBA 2 and 3 and 4. I would say it starts to have less value as you get towards that very detailed design stage. I think certainly the value that it creates is better up front when you're still at early kind of concept design. But certainly in terms of the support it gives, I can give probably more of an Akerlof example. So we're working at the moment with a client in healthcare. They've done the value toolkit up front, and that enabled some of those very early discussions with planning around what those high level objectives and sort of helped iron out any alignment in that space. And now there are much more detailed plans that are coming in that include all the traditional very detailed employment and skills plans and social value approaches that sit within, but that's been a step beyond. So yeah, I don't know if that helps, but anywhere from stage 0 to 2 is probably ideal. You could probably do it at 3. Beyond that, you probably want to be in a much more detailed, this is what we're doing.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. A final call for any further questions. We may be able to take 1 or 2, but a question from me is what's next? What should we be looking for? You alluded to a launch in spring, I believe. I picked that up. So as a sector, across the whole of the sector, what are we looking from you now coming out about the Value Toolkit?
So what you can look for in immediate is that we will be updating all of our external narrative around some of the technical changes that you've kind of heard me outline today. So that will be the immediate thing that comes. We're looking at the moment as to whether we deliver any facilitator training up front or whether we wait for the legacy ownership, and that is part of the discussion that we'll be having with the organisations that are looking at legacy options. So what I would say is sort of get more knowledge on value-based delivery for the next couple of months, understand what sits behind it, understand how it links back to Future Generations Act, start thinking about how you might include it in tenders. And if you are consultant contractor side, watch this space, because at some point, probably sort of June time, we'll be talking about what comes next in terms of people being able to sign up for that certified facilitator training.
Thank you. Super. Well, I haven't got any more questions that have come through, so I will just thank you so much for taking the time to give us a really good overview, next steps, what we should be looking out for, and just really fielding some of those questions as well. So, you know, I think it's been really, really useful, Ellie. So thank you very much for doing that. We shall certainly look out for everything and continue to share information as well throughout Wales, as much as we possibly can. So, you know, do keep us in that loop so we can help in any way, and just very much look forward to seeing some of the projects, the pilots really that have come up, and seeing this being filtered through across the whole of the sector. So many thanks for all the work that you've done around this. It's hugely beneficial, and I'll leave everybody off to go and get some lunch.
Thanks everyone, lovely to meet you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks all.